Hello and welcome to the SBDC Tech's second annual Women Talk Tech Conference series. I'm Julie Cranston, Director of the SBDC at UCI Beal Applied Innovation, and I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today. Today's webinar is brought to you by the SBDC at UCI Beal Applied Innovation, UCR Epic SBDC, and Octane Launchpad SBDC. The SBDC is funded in part by the U.S. Small Business Administration and the state of California. The SBDC is here to help you start, grow, and succeed in your business by providing no-cost expert consulting and training such as this webinar. A little housekeeping before we begin. Everyone is muted during the webinar, and tomorrow the recorded webinar and a PDF copy of the slides will be sent to all participants. We will have time for Q&A with our panel at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to ask questions during the webinar by clicking on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. A quick note, if our panel runs long, our panelists have graciously agreed to stay to answer questions for a few minutes past the 1 o'clock hour. So if you can stay logged on, please do. The recording will include both the panel and Q&A, so you won't miss any of the great insights from the panel. So before we get started with our panel discussion, I'd like to welcome our other two directors, JC Ruffalo from Octane Launchpad. JC, do you want to tell us a little bit about your center?
Sure. Thank you, Julie, and good afternoon, everyone. It's good to have you all here. Excited about today's session. So my name is JC Ruffalo. As Julie mentioned, I'm the director of the Launchpad SBDC Accelerator Program hosted by Octane. We focus on helping both tech and life science startups, a little bit later stage startups that are looking for their late seed Series A round of capital. And we put them through our peer review process internally and then try our best to expose you to resources, capital, and expertise throughout the network. So with that, Julie, I will turn it back to you.
Great. Scott, do you want to tell us a little bit about your center at UCR?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Julie. So at UC Riverside, as some of you may or may not know, we're one of the most diverse campuses in the UC system, if not the country. And we've had a focus on basically women and minority-owned startups for 4 years since we started our program. So that is kind of what we do. We spend a lot of time working to bring what we call deep tech out of the labs, and we mentor about 100 startups in our region, which is inland Southern California. And we focus on finding executive talent and first capital. So whether that's angel, pre-seed, or seed funding. And we're mentoring about 100 startups right now and have mentored about 370 startups in the last 4 years of our program. So really happy to be here and happy to support this conference for the second year.
Great, thanks so much, Scott. And at UCI Beal Applied Innovation at our SBDC, we work with slightly earlier startups than JC does, but also in Orange County that focus on tech and life science. So we're all three complementary centers that work to help tech and life science startups accelerate and grow and find funding, of course. So right now we'll get to our program. Our program today will be moderated by Paige Smith. Paige is an associate in Stradling's corporate practice group. She represents companies, underwriters, and investors across a broad range of industries, including technology, life science, banking, e-commerce, beverages, and social media. Paige advises clients in general corporate matters, venture capital finance transactions, securities offerings, Securities Act and Exchange Act reporting, and trademark license agreements. In particular, she's passionate about helping startups. Thank you so much for being here today, Paige. I'll turn the program over to you to have our panelists introduce themselves.
Thank you so much, Julia. Again, I'm Paige Smith. I personally am very excited about the topic at hand here today. And before we begin, I want to thank everyone who's joined us remotely, whether you're wearing leggings, pants, pajamas. We're happy you're here, and we hope that you'll get a lot out of this discussion. Before I go forward, please ask questions. So if you have questions that you prepared in advance, or you have general questions about this topic, or you pick up on something that we bring up and have a follow-up that you want us to get into more detail on, please feel free to ask them. We'll be able to get to them towards the end of the panel. So when it comes to startups, everyone loves discussing how to raise, how to get the money. But for those founders who are able to close their rounds, many people find that they're more on their own when it comes to making the strategic decisions around how to actually deploy capital. So given we have a limited amount of time here, we want to make this as substantive as we can, and we could not be more excited to introduce you to Amy, Cathy, and Lubna here, who have really rich experiences in this area. So Amy, Cathy, and Lubna, in that order, can you briefly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background before we get into questions?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. My name is Amy Fox. I'm a VP of HR at Halozyme Therapeutics. I have lots of, I love to build organizations. I'm passionate about that. And I've typically come into organizations when they're about 40, 50 people and then help them scale and grow to go on to achieve great things. And I'm really excited to be here.
Thanks, Amy. So
Hi,
Cathy?
everybody. Yes. Hi, everybody. My name is Cathy Kim. I'm the COO of a healthcare technology company, software in the cloud, called Voluware. And I guess I'm going to be speaking both from, we're going through the funding process right now, but I'm going to be speaking from two perspectives, this one, as well as the startup I was at before that did go through a massive funding round right as I joined. I'm a recovering lawyer. I've been in recovery for over 10 years, and I very much love the business side of things. So thank you for having me today.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Lubna?
There we go. My name is Lubna, and I am the founder and CEO of Invoy. Invoy is in the digital health space, something I'm really passionate about, but we're also anchored with a breath analysis device that allows us to measure very low concentrations of important chemicals in your breath. And we use that information to help pick nutrition and exercise programs that work for somebody. So it's less reliant on a bathroom scale, more reliant on their breath. And then we've coupled that with a coaching platform, and we presently sell into large companies as a benefit. And that's what we do.
Awesome. All right, thank you, everybody. So this first question is for everyone. Each of you have been a part of startups that have raised funding and then, as Cathy noted, scaled rapidly. Can each of you briefly share the context around that expansion experience? So what was the size of the company? What was the size of the funding round? And then what was the time frame during which the company actually scaled? And feel free to aggregate your experiences, because I know some of you have experiences with multiple companies. So let's start with Cathy on that.
So I'm going to speak about the prior company, which was a solar company, which meant that we were technology and manufacturing. So at the time, it was $110 million of funding. It was the largest, it was led by Kleiner Perkins, and it was the largest green tech investment made at that point in time. And we scaled, I think, in less than a year. So it was standing up two ginormous manufacturing facility, hiring, I think, a couple hundred people each in Las Vegas and here in Seal Beach, California. And then hiring dozens of engineers, sales, just everything all at once. It was absolute insanity. It felt like sometimes we were, and when you have that much money, you can actually spend it. But it was, I will say that it was hectic. It was overwhelming. It was really nice to have the resources, but sometimes it is a little bit of a, I think, careful what you wish for situation. I'm sure it's what people feel like when they go on Oprah's My Favorite Things and they have to deal with like a crush of orders would be my guess.
Yeah.
And so that's that was that experience. And it was literally along every single vector you could absolutely name. And then the manufacturing obviously through a very different component on top of it versus just a pure technology play.
Yeah, that's great. And it's super, I think you're in a rare position of having been able to raise that amount and then having the difficulty of determining next steps with that.
Yes.
So then, Amy, how about you? What's your experience with this?
I typically come in a little later stage. So at my prior company, Evolus, which is in Orange County, I was hired in, they had gone through an IPO the year that I was hired. So that's where their funding was coming from. And I was hired in October. We had around 40 people. And then by April of the following year, we had scaled to 245. So very rapid expansion. We had hired almost the entire leadership team, as well as the people to ensure a successful launch. Evolus has a commercial product, so they wanted to ensure that successful launch. So it was a people, system, and processes all in place, and it was definitely a Like Cathy was saying, it's building the plane while you're flying the plane, which is just really fun, but it is not for the faint of heart.
Yeah. And how about you, Lubna?
So Invoy has been my entire professional career. So I think like there's been a couple of growth inflection points that were both very challenging but different. The first one is when we went from 5 people to 20. That was actually a pretty significant growth. Not necessarily a lot of people, but it was like 5 people that like knew everything about each other, or that, you know, could easily call your spouse if you had like a question about what they like. It's just like, it was like very, very tight knit 5 people. The growth from 5 to 20 was suddenly like, what do you mean this person doesn't know like XYZ piece of information? It was coupled with a $5 million round. That was like kind of our Series A. And with our Series B, it was 20 to 50. And that happened really fast. The 5 to 20 at least took place over like a year or so, but the 20 to 50 took place in like a month and a half. And it was like associated with a very large kind of enterprise customer ramp. It was also like this summer. So it was like every possible thing from an economy standpoint and everything else like it was also really shifting. I think that one was, it was a lot of fun because I think we had more people to kind of spread the work amongst, and like that core of 20 had now become like, you know, really good managers and developed as really good leaders over time. But I think supervising people, like hiring people that you like, for me personally was a big difference. Like I hadn't actually sat through all the interviews, which was like a very big kind of cultural difference, you know, and like people hired people into the company. They weren't all my hires, you know, that type of thing. So it was a big difference. It was also unusual to close around. This calendar year was a very, very tumultuous time to be raising money and to feel confident enough, I think, to be able to hire more people at that level. I think those were a lot of unusual challenges about this year.
Yeah, definitely. And congrats to you on being able to close a Series B amidst everything that's going on.
Yeah, it was. If you want the details of that, we certainly get into it now that it's closed. But it was a very harrowing experience, I think, over the past little while. This was a very tough year, especially when you have a hardware product. There were like 3 different things happening at once. We had a big enterprise ramp, so we were doing a 10x growth. We were in the middle of a funding round, which didn't close on time, that's for sure. So like that, you know, that became kind of superimposed upon that. And I honestly think this was probably one of the most challenging years in terms of leadership with people, where like the amount of importance that it would take of like keeping your existing teams in place. We were very fortunate that we didn't have to like lay anybody off, but it was really tight in order to make that happen. But then taking on the responsibility of hiring additional people, I just don't take that lightly. So I think those were very unique circumstances to all happen in parallel.
Yeah, and definitely I want to get into when you were going from, I think you said 20 to 50 people, yeah. You know, who you were thinking about in terms of human capital, which kind of leads to our next question, which is when you started contemplating your growth trajectory and as you were thinking through your Series A and your Series B, and this question, I think, Lubna, you would be great to answer this, and then we can speak to Cathy. When you're figuring out your objectives and your strategies, was there one area that revealed itself immediately as the key priority, or were there a ton of competing priorities where they were fighting for attention and it wasn't clear, you know, which one came out on top? And with that, how did you determine how to narrow down on what your priorities should be? And maybe you can speak to your Series A versus your Series B, Lubna.
It's a great question. So somebody told me this as a piece of advice right around the time that we were going through the Series A, and I of course did not understand what they were talking about, so I didn't. But the second time I actually like learned from it, so I did it properly. But they made the comment that as you're building a company, you should kind of view it like an organism, and everything should be connected, and then you should like make sure that, you know, the number of people that you have in one place kind of flows, and as in how you're hiring people, you need to make sure you've got really good metrics, right? So that when you leave a particular place, at least in my case as like a founder, when you leave a particular department, that you don't leave it without there being metrics so that you can kind of, you know, keep watching what's happening, right? You've hired good leaders in that place, and you kind of logically move on. So when we did 5 to 20, it was kind of like whatever department I thought they would go in. You know, if we hired an engineer one day and then a, you know, person into the design team another day, like that was fine. Like, so there wasn't, there wasn't necessarily a very logical focus in terms of where we were hiring people. And I think like in terms of onboarding, there were a lot of growth challenges. I really give a lot of credit to the people that made it to Invoy's first 20 of like, congratulations on a very unusual onboarding. It was like, yeah, I don't think we understood that you should train people, you know, so there were a lot of things there that we needed to learn on our side. When we went from 20 to 50, I actually think like, especially considering the circumstances, I'm actually very, I don't mean this arrogantly, but I'm actually very proud of the way we did that, because it was like more departmentally focused. We made sure that there was, good, maybe not great, but there were at least good training practices in place to get people comfortable. You know, I made it kind of a rule that I'll do like at least a coffee or a lunch with every new person within the first like 2 weeks. You know, we there's just certain things like that. Like even if I wasn't involved in their interview process, at least get to know who these people are. We're still small enough where that's possible. So I think it was a lot more logical. I think it was a better experience for the person who was joining the team. And then I also think in parallel with that, we changed, I think, culturally into a more metrics driven organization about 12 months ago. And so this time around, when we were hiring people, everybody came in and they knew what it would take to win. So it was like, look, by Friday, if you can get these things done, like you're doing a great job, right? Which I think is really important with all the chaos of the year, to like just break things down into like wins for different teams or different individual team members. Which requires actually knowing what the business does, which honestly at the time that you're in your Series A, I'm not sure you know that yet.
Right.
But for where we are today, like, you know, like that, I think that's the right way to kind of like be adding people within an organization.
Yeah. And I'm curious, something you brought up is that, which I think, you know, working with a lot of early stage companies, this is very common, that the onboarding process is not necessarily streamlined when you're at your Series C or your Series A. So I'm curious if there were any specific, you brought up metrics as something that you used to address, but what some of the pain points were when you went into the Series B that you thought, I really want to make sure that I address this and that we take care of this issue, that if you could have gone back and maybe you didn't have the capability to even deal with that at Series A, but when you went on to Series B, if you could handle.
Well, I'll share some things here, and I know like that, you know, the group of people that we're talking to is going to be diverse. So I'll just share some things that should fall into the no of like, just don't make this Invoy Lubna mistake in the future. When an employee, when an employee joins, let's make sure they have a laptop, you know, like on day one, they have an address. Like there's certain things like that like honestly, like the act of having a checklist of these things need to be in place 48 hours before this person starts is kind of a big deal. And it sounds silly because I think we put a lot of effort into like, oh my God, we finally found this like really great candidate. And then you're all excited about what that first candidate is going to do. And you forget about the first 15 minutes when that person walks into the office and it's sort of like, oh, so yeah, that's right. You do need a desk and a chair, you know? And so there's like, I think having that checklist, it sounds really silly, trivial. It's really important, and it takes no time to actually do. And you just have to like get into the act of like, I think engaging in a level of discipline for that. I think it's minor, but I think it's really important. I think the other one, and this one is one where I would give as a B for this right now, but I think having a really good sense for what you expect that person to do at 30, 60, and 90 days. I think the reason it's different at Series B than Series A is as a business at Series A, if you can figure out what you're doing in 30, 60, and 90 days, congratulations, you're doing a really good job, because a lot of us don't actually know what we're doing 90 days in the future. But I think by the time you're like a Series B company, for each individual person, you should be able to say, like, this is what it means for you to be doing good at these different time periods. And one thing I think we did well, like I would say we do that. We're getting better at doing that. But like, I think one thing we are doing for sure really well is what you should be able to do at day 5. So like, I think like making sure that there is that first checkpoint with that person, like by day 5, you've had a manager lunch, you've had, you know exactly how to get in and out of different, email systems, and, you're like, it's not just you have access, but you actually know what you're doing. I think that just gives that person a level of comfort when they come in, that they have some level of control and ability to contribute. So those are just like some small things. Obviously, there's people that have way more experience than I do on this topic, but for kind of an emerging growth company, sometimes if those like little pieces can make a big difference, and they're really not that difficult, I think, to put in place.
Yeah, so bringing in metrics, onboarding people appropriately, getting everybody knowing each other. Yeah, I think those are really, again, sometimes obvious solutions don't necessarily get incorporated. And so, again, to remind everyone, what we're talking about is, what the priorities we're going to focus on when we're deciding how to deploy our capital. So Cathy, I'm curious what your experiences were there.
I'm lucky, I think, because we're going through this right now. And for us, it's very obvious. A huge amount of the funding that we're going after is sales and marketing, because we've literally spent almost $0 on it. And we've been lucky that it's very word of mouth. And we have someone who's very dedicated to cold emailing and working his network and expanding it. But it's very straightforward that's where a huge chunk of change goes. We have to hire Marcom. The executive team, we have a lot of skills between the three of us, and we overlap in key areas. But the one area where we just all blow and are terrible is sales and marketing. So it's nice and clear. What's interesting is that as we're doing this and as we're talking to investors, there's a lot of other categories that we hadn't really thought needed quite as much attention that are actually coming up to the forefront. So I'm calling it a little bit of the less sexy categories, with all due respect to Paige and to my former profession. Legal is really becoming a very big one, right? One of the reasons that startups like to hire me is because I'm a recovering lawyer and I can bring that skill to the table, and you're not paying for outside counsel. But it's just too overwhelming now for me. And it's a lot of stuff now out of my ken. Like, I'm like, hey, this is malpractice for me to even do this. We need to hire this stuff out. So it's really interesting, the stuff that's still bubbling up that we thought we had a really good handle on. And I loved everything that Lubna said. Actually, it resonates both with what we're thinking about in our experience, as well as what I went through with the solar company, that there were a lot of basics, like have the laptop and have all the software loaded and all of that stuff, right? Just ready to go. I think you forget how welcome it makes that employee feel that everything is ready. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I think something that both of what you have raised that maybe we can talk about a little bit later if we have time is kind of culture, and making sure that there is, an understood culture when you're scaling. Which would be nice to dig into as well. So I think, we've discussed a little bit about how you named your key objectives. And I know for you, Cathy, it was, right now sales and marketing is your key. When we look at this, and Amy, I'm wondering if you can start us off here, how much of actually tackling these objectives depended on hiring staff? So thinking from an IP perspective, regulatory perspective, R&D, as Cathy brought up, sales and marketing. Amy, what has your experience been in terms of, dealing with companies that are starting to expand, hiring staff? How does that relate to achieving these objectives?
Yeah, so one of the things we do, and it's like Cathy was saying, where she was like, okay, it's what are those business priorities and what are those key kind of capabilities that you need to execute against those priorities, and having that discussion and really having it at the leadership team, so you're really clear on what those priorities are and what you need to do to get things done. And then from there, looking at, okay, what are the implications to talent? Are these things that, and how does it impact how does each area flow into achieving those? So, in a life sciences company, there is, an IP element, or there can be a regulatory element that you need to do to get that product to market. And so it's looking at how each piece fits into the overall picture. And then, you have a fixed amount of money. So then how do you prioritize? What do you absolutely need to ensure a successful launch? And then we looked at, okay, what could we use contingent resources for? Can we outsource? What can we outsource? And all of those things. But it's really going through and looking at that, and also looking at as we're looking at those priorities and the impact that they have in terms of the talent, where are gaps? Where do we need to shore up, and then how do you prioritize those? So it's really kind of just a very structured approach, but I really try to keep it simple and not overcomplicate things in the workforce planning perspective. Ideally, what we're looking at too is what role talent plays in terms of our strategy, and really using it as an input to strategy as well as an output in terms of how we're executing it. So spending some time talking to the leadership team about that.
Yeah, and Amy, I'm sure that it's very difficult when you come in because, if you're coming in a little bit more towards growth stage, but the company is still very mindful at that point of, every dollar matters, you're weighing wanting to be conservative with, bringing on new hires, but also needing to plan ahead and having people in place for your growth. And I think that probably puts you in an interesting position with some of the companies you're working with.
Yeah, it's always kind of a push and a pull, because it's like you want it, especially when those dollars are so precious, and it's like you want to push everything to the functions and the capabilities that are going to ensure business success. But then there's all the infrastructure behind that keeps the lights on, and just finding that right balance. There is a trade-off. Sometimes you do it really well, and sometimes all of a sudden it's like, oh, we forgot about that. But that's one of the great things, I think, is when you have a good culture and you have that leadership team that really comes together, is being able then to have those conversations and kind of shift and reprioritize and make those trade-offs so that you can get everything up and running in the right way.
Yeah. And Lubna, I'm curious, when you were going, as you said, from 5 to 20 to 50, maybe what principles you were guided by when you were looking at, expanding your team. How did you come up with these numbers in the first place? Was it just discussing kind of the principles in that field, or how did this impact your decision making when you were expanding, looking at the IP, regulatory, sales, et cetera?
You mean in terms of like headcount?
Right.
Or putting people into different departments. So I think it really had to do with getting better in planning. And I think it kind of boils back down to like the entire discussion on metrics and KPIs and things like that, of just once you kind of get a sense for, okay, we actually have a roadmap for the next, 12 months or 18 months, and you kind of get comfortable with the fact that it's subject to change. I think it actually becomes a lot easier to step back and say, okay, well, I need these bodies in this role to be able to do these things, right? And then I think it just becomes like a lot less reactive. And that again, I honestly, even with the experiences that I have, if I were doing another startup, I'm not sure you can do that until X number of people and Y level of growth, because there is a component of like, well, things are changing so much until you get to a certain stage, right? And so I think for where we are right now, that's the way we make decisions now. But it wasn't for lack of good intentions before. I think we didn't have stability in the technology or in the business planning to be able to exercise that level of care. I think one other thing though that happened around employee 20 is we did hire Hannah to join our team, and I gave her what I thought was an interesting title at the time of like people ops and culture. And I'd heard about like people hiring, and you also have to understand, for me, like I never worked anywhere before, so like organizational design, like basics, like were like a big gap, right? For me, like I didn't understand a lot of these principles that somebody who'd worked in a larger company might have actually understood. So I'd always heard about like, people ops is an interesting role or whatnot, but I added culture into that because it just really felt like that was something that we didn't have up until that time. Like we had people that were sort of handpicked, but then the people that didn't make it or whatever, like it was very clear what those principles were. And when I hired Hannah, in hindsight, she didn't have any HR experience or anything like that, right? But like she actually represented what the culture was supposed to be. And it was really helpful in working with her. Like one of the first things we did was actually define like these are the 4 kind of cultural attributes that we are looking for. And something that somebody told me when it comes to values that's really resonated with me is the values should be uncompromising. You either have them or you don't. Capabilities can be something that you can evaluate on a spectrum or whatnot, but when it comes to some of the core business values, it needs to be like, you know, a 0 or 1. The person either has them or they don't. It shouldn't be something that you compromise on. And I think that really, really helped ensure that there was a very consistent feel and that people worked well together. You can celebrate their differences. I'm not saying that everybody's like, you know, exactly the same, but on those 4 kind of core areas at a value level, everybody shared certain principles. I think that was really, really helpful in defining kind of the organizational culture.
Yeah. And do you remember what your values were at that time when you named them? I don't want to put you on the spot in case if they've evolved, but
no, it's a great question. I mean, like we put them on the website too. So I mean, like, you know, for us, it ends up being the person needs to be bold, right? It's not arrogant, but they need to be capable, comfortable of like making a decision. We're trying to do something that's very disruptive. So you need to have the ability to kind of like, you know, be bold in kind of your views. The second one was data driven. So it was something that we learned very early on that we had a very hard time with people that could not navigate Excel. So I would that way. So like, you know, like there's a certain component of, okay, people do need to be data driven. A high degree of like for us of people that exhibit empathy. So like just making sure that people work really well together within the company. And then the last one was also like lifelong learning. So something that we, I think, are really good at or have had a lot of success with is people that come in early in their careers and just get progressively better. And then even for people that come in later in their careers that they actually want to develop with us. And so we just really want to make sure we celebrate that. And then the other thing we did over the summer is on top of those 4 principles that we try to celebrate. And so like, you know, Hannah sends out like a newsletter every 2 weeks, and we try to highlight one person that exhibits those traits in each newsletter that we send out. But the other thing we really tried to do is we now created the Startup Badges of Honor program. And so it's like these things that, you know, like, you know, I came in on day 1 and, you know, as much as we try not to do this, but it still happens, you know, like I came in on day 1 and I was told to solve this like company critical problem that needed to be dealt with by day 10, right? And instead of that seeming kind of unusual or whatever, like, let's just actually call that what it is. It's like a badge of honor. And these are actually the stories that you take with you, you know, from these experiences. And so let's kind of really make sure we celebrate those things also and talk about them. And then one of those on there that I think is really helpful from a culture point of view is being able to share when those things happened that are kind of emblematic of startups, but they're also like painful at the time.
right.
Being able to talk about those things. And so that's also the value of like being able to see other people who have earned that, so that if you feel like you're going through it, that you can go talk to somebody else. And just kind of hear how they made it through, or get some advice on like, you know, how you can maybe handle this in a more proactive fashion or whatnot. So those are maybe the 2 main things that we've tried to do on the culture side.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. And but definitely thinking about naming key principles when you're hiring employees. That's something I've heard from several very successful founders, is that they really name their objectives and they're very principles driven. And so it's not just with, you know, the mission of the business, but also who they're bringing in. Cathy, I'm wondering how culture came in, especially with your earlier startup when you were expanding so rapidly. I know that sometimes that's impossible to, or it feels impossible to be mindful of culture while you're keeping track of so many other, you know, things related to your expansion. Was culture something that you were able to address at that stage, or what were your experiences with that?
So they both, my current company and that last company, represent the 2 extremes.
Right.
The last company, I don't know why, but I think we just grew too rapidly to
Right.
even think about or instill or have a chance to instill the culture. And there were a lot of other outside forces at bay at the time as well. It was basically right before solar just crashed as an industry. So that was part of it. Then it became about survival, but there really just wasn't a culture. And then what culture did exist was unfortunately something that we've all heard about and continues to pervade tech companies, I think, unfortunately, in terms of it was very male dominated. There were a lot of strip clubs involved. There were a lot of Vegas trips. There was a lot of boys club stuff, and solar and electricity and power tends to be a very male dominated industry anyway. So there was maybe that overlay of the industry. And so there really just wasn't a culture to speak of. So the flip side is of course that now I'm at a company where I get to, it's one of the things I've always loved doing, no matter where I was, with, if I was at a big law firm or if I was at, at a nonprofit, was actually helping to set the culture and to make sure that it was something that made people want to be there, work harder, do better things. I really ascribe to work hard, play hard. And I think as part of that, then it does make it easier to hire and find people. It makes it easier to expand and really think about your culture in a way that you don't. And I think that we should distill it right into some principles and stuff. But right now, what I basically just say, especially for our technology in our company, I'm like, you have to drink the Kool-Aid. We're such a different company. The way we run our software, the way we do healthcare, the way we built our software, the fact that honestly we are a software company, but it's so hard to hire women engineers or people identifying as women. Either way, it's really, really difficult to find them. And so there's a lot of proactive work and thought that goes into it. But for us, you have to drink the Kool-Aid. And I know right away if you're not drinking the Kool-Aid. And in my head, I'm like, so I know you're going to leave me in 6 months to a year, right? And then I'm thinking about protecting my IP and making sure that we don't give you too much of our IP. We don't tell you too much about our secret sauces and stuff like that. And we know very quickly who is drinking the Kool-Aid. And I don't think I've actually ever been at a company where it's been so important to do that and to really just like embrace the mission. So it doesn't mean you won't be successful, but I just know you're not going to stick around.
Yeah. And you raised something there that definitely somewhere where I worked before, it was the same way, where if you are not, the last firm where I worked was very hardcore about startups. And if someone interviewed and they gave any indication that they are not die hard about this, then it was like, we're done. It doesn't matter, if they're the best law student or anything like that. And so I agree. We came up with kind of ways to kind of understand, but I'm curious because I think that this can apply to a lot of people when you're looking for people at that critical stage, joining a startup or an emerging growth company and growth stage. I mean, that is a sometimes harrowing task. So I'm wondering if when you were in those interviews, you said that you could tell immediately, but I'm curious your advice to other people who are in similar situations hiring, kind of what indicators you've learned over time. This person is worth us investing in and bringing in, and these are some warning signs when we're bringing in this hire.
So I'm literally in the process of hiring right now. I screen for it right away before I even talk to them. I send them, if I like their resume, I send them questions that explain we are a startup. Here's everything that's at it. This is either going to make you want to vomit or it's going to excite you, right? When you hear my description, if this excites you, keep moving on and answer the next question. And then I tell them, we really need people who understand risk, embrace the risk. You can be scared about it. You can talk to us all about it you want, but if you're not going to do anything because you're frozen because of the risk, you're going to do a terrible job here because you're going to make ginormous mistakes. Ginormous. Every single one of us has done it. And you must tell us about those mistakes immediately. You must not be afraid. And if you have problems with any of these things, then just exit now. And if they have good responses to that, and this is a little bit of the lawyer in me that I want it in writing that they've understood this, Then I speak to them, and then I'm very happy and jovial and collegial, but I also explain there are other aspects to this that a lot of engineers don't want to do. That's not why they got into engineering. They didn't want to interface directly with the users. They don't care about the service side of software as a service. And I'm not always right, but I can tell if they're actually really scared in a way that they're going to get frozen. But then we're still not right. What's actually Amy will be able to tell me better than most what the metric is, right? Something like 75% of hires don't work out or something, it's a very high statistic. And usually a few weeks in, for an engineer especially, I can tell right away whether or not they're drinking the Kool-Aid or not. So yeah, I know pretty quickly once they're in. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, I think that's really, that's a really interesting perspective and really helpful in terms of what the metric is for Kool-Aid drinking. But I think that there's something to be said for any founder or anyone who is in this position where they're hiring, objectives need to be clear when you're bringing someone in, because it's not for the faint of heart to join a company at that stage. So switching gears a little bit, every dollar matters at this stage, right? And this is a question, I think, for everyone. What strategic challenges when you were growing your staff did you face? And we addressed culture a little bit, but when it came to the question of outsourcing, did that play a role in lieu of permanent hires? So wondering if Lubna can get us started with talking about, strategic challenges, maybe from going from Series A to Series B, and other experiences you've had.
It's a great question. I haven't quite figured out how to do outside services well when you don't have a good in-house team that's really staying on top of it. So I think you kind of have to either when your dollars matter. I mean, the downside is going to be in most instances, working with an outside resource requires, I think, two things. One, it's going to be more expensive than hiring somebody in-house. So like as a general matter, in terms of dollars and cents, it may be less time, but you got to find the right party, and it's got to be like the scope of work has to be pretty well contained. And if you can't define that well, which I think is 90% of every time we've done a consultant until we really recognize this principle, it usually ended up being like, okay, 9 months later, we started getting sloppy about our management 3 months into the relationship. And now you're just spending money on something that you really should have contained and like managed better to begin with. So I think over time, we've become a lot more judicious about using external resources. And then at that time, you really do hold to like a scope of work and, and there's some definition around it, but there's also somebody who's like a point person for managing whoever that party is. I think that from a cost containment standpoint, then it kind of works really well. You've got like an in-house person that's doing a good job. And then you've got an external expert who, actually feels like they can communicate. They've got, like the right person within the company that is spending the time working with them, et cetera. So I think that's been the way it's been helpful for us. I think the other part that makes it challenging when it comes to external resources is there's always a cost, and there's a hidden cost of onboarding, and there's a hidden cost of offloading them.
Right. Yes.
You kind of lost the institutional knowledge in between. And so then when you're hired, it's just sort of a latent thing that kind of propagates. So it kind of feels like you need to build a team. And if that means that team has to be small at the beginning, there's not enough capacity for you to hire into these different departments. So you have to have a team that's small and they can kind of wear multiple hats. I think that's the right thing to do. But then if you're going to bring in an external consultant, I think you should just be really, really clear on why you're bringing them in, because usually that dollar amount is higher, like that hourly rate's higher, and it can easily get out of control. And sure, it may not be as stressful as like paying payroll every 2 weeks, but at some point those bills do catch up. So anyway, those are maybe some thoughts on cost containment.
Yeah. And I'm hoping that we can follow up if we have time later on just the issue of delegation and oversight over outsourcing, because I think that that is something that is really worthy of discussion. But before that, I'm wondering, Amy, what your insight is in terms of how you have encountered the issue of outsourcing, what experiences you've had, and other strategic challenges you've seen in HR when companies have been scaling.
No, I think, HR is something that actually lends itself well to outsourcing when you're a small organization. There's lots of great HR practitioners that consult for startup companies and can help kind of bridge that gap. And they kind of function as that HR person in your organization, kind of embed themselves in the organization and can help make that transition. I think also on the recruiting side, that's where I've really leveraged contingent resources to help with that. When we scaled at Evolus, we utilized a company that we could not have hired 150 people in 2 months without their help. It was very, very expensive, but that's what we needed to do, and to get those people hired and onboarded quickly. I think, I do think what Lubna was saying about that, your time is so valuable, and you think, oh, I can, kind of using a contingent resource can help, it's kind of set it and forget it. And that it doesn't work. It really doesn't work that way. You do have to have the capabilities in-house to have that oversight so that you're getting the end product that you want. But those are some of the ways that I've used it. Like I said, HR really as companies are scaling for growth, there's a lot. It really makes sense to outsource that function, and then until you get to a certain size, and then you need that full-time resource, then you hire somebody inside.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. And Cathy, I'm wondering what your experiences have been with considering outsourcing or other, I think we've talked a little bit about just the challenges of scaling so quickly, but curious whether outsourcing came into play there, what your experiences have been with that.
I think so much of it was exactly what Amy and Lubna touched upon and expounded upon. So I would just third everything that they said. But certainly now for us in my current company, there are things that absolutely make sense, just even for HIPAA and high-tech compliance reasons, to actually outsource, to have done by an outside party, because it looks better, and it's better for a whole bunch of different reasons. It builds in redundancies. And then we're limited in ways, right? We cannot outsource outside of the country. I know I don't want my healthcare information outside the country. What hackers are doing to it in the US is different.
Right.
But I just don't want and there are just organizations who are like, it just cannot leave the shore. And some places, they don't care, it can go. So there's that aspect of it. But definitely if we don't define it, and if we don't know what we're outsourcing, and if we can't manage it well, then we don't do it, because it's just like setting money on fire, which we definitely don't want to do. We do find for my people that aren't drinking the Kool-Aid and who leave us, they end up being our best contractors. They're our best contractors and our best outsourcing. They know exactly how everything runs. I have them sign an independent contractor agreement before they leave. The NDAs, the BAs, everything is still operative, and stuff like that. And they're great as independent contractors for, depending on how long they want to do it, how long we want them to do it. Eventually their knowledge obsoletes out, but they're fantastic for that as well. So, it's totally don't burn your bridges.
Yeah. And that's a testament to, what you're doing there, that if someone, this isn't the perfect fit for their entire lifestyle, but they're happy to keep working, then I think that's something that I've seen a number of companies do, especially companies that just have really, they have tough demands, and they understand that this environment is not necessarily right for everyone, but that doesn't mean that someone can't be really talented and able to contribute in their own way, kind of as a contractor. So it's interesting. And then kind of moving on to what got left behind. So as your company grew, and Amy, I want to hear from you on this, but the company you're working with grew, were there key areas that management realized, we left this out of the expansion plan? How did that gap get realized? What did you have to do to get back on track or close the gap? Curious what your thoughts are there.
Sure, we did. Yeah, when you're moving quickly, you do overlook things. And like I said, we were throwing every single dollar and resources into our commercial team to ensure a successful launch. So the G&A functions like HR, accounting, IT, we were small and mighty teams working on the bare bones. And I think that as the company started to ramp up, we realized, whoa, we need that infrastructure in place. We need data to flow between these functions. We need all sorts of things like that. And it came very quickly in terms of, because a process would break. And so that was where, as a leadership team, we were able to come together, identify what the issue was, and then start to come up with a plan on how to fill that gap. And a lot of times we would bring in a contingent resource to kind of help short-term solve that problem. I think the other thing we did was look at, okay, what could we do as a short-term fix that wouldn't necessarily last long-term? In HR, we did that where we transitioned HRIS systems, and we had an interim fix, and then we had our final system, but we had to buy some time in order to have the funding available to fund that HRIS system. So we had to kind of think it through in phases. And sometimes you put something in place that you're going to tear down and then come back again. I think the other thing where we can see some gaps comes back to culture, and really thinking about, as you're moving quickly, okay, spending that time and being intentional about culture and thinking about how you're going to pull through those culture attributes in all the different touch points of the employee experience is something that as people are really focused on execution, sometimes gets put aside. So that was another area that we were very intentional about to pull that through.
And I'm curious, now that I think everyone's kind of touched on culture a little bit here, but just want to dig down a little bit into that. So when you've worked with the company that has, maybe, and I think that's very practical, because I think, or it seems practical, because the thought is, well, we just have to get this done. And so it's something that gets pushed aside, and then you wake up one day and you might just be looking around with a lot of employees that have really low morale, and we can just, we could go into the reasons why culture matters, but I think that we can all accept that it does matter, because it leads to retention, it leads to higher quality work and everything like that. So my question is Lubna kind of touched on some of the things that she had done with her company to work on culture. What are some of your thoughts that a company, maybe at the earlier stage and then in growth stage, can really be mindful of that they're incorporating with regards to culture?
Yeah, that's one of my favorites. I'm so passionate about culture because I do think it really drives the organization. And I think what Lubna was talking about and was really identifying those culture attributes and what is really how you get things done and what matters most is really, really important. And then looking at how you pull that through. And what we did at Evolus was we put together a group of employees to work on that and to really think about, okay, how are we going to pull those culture attributes through in everything we did, whether it was activities, our performance, how we measured performance, how we communicated to people through all hands or all those different things, because they really are what's going to guide the way and on how you execute. So we've done it that way. It's just looking at those employee connections, how you work, and it is really simple, like having the checklist so people are ready start, because you just make that first, you only have one chance to make that first impression. And so really thinking about that employee experience and what it's like to get going, and how to have all those things in place so you can get assimilated into the company and start working right away. It's some of the real practical things, but then it's also, how you communicate and the different channels that you use for that. And we've done things through Instagram, we've done all hands. I mean, now we're all on Zoom, and having those regular touch points with the leaders to keep people focused on the key priorities has really made a difference during, with everyone working from home.
Yeah, and I'm sure we could do an entirely separate Zoom or a separate meeting on how to bring our entire company to Zoom life and what adjustments to make. But going back just a little bit to Lubna, I realize we only have a few minutes left, but I'm curious, Lubna, going back to the question of, were there any areas that got left out in your expansion? How did they come up? How did they reveal themselves? And what did you do to get back on track?
I think anyone who's not is able to skip the our plan didn't work phase, kudos to them. But absolutely 100%, there are things that get left out of the plan. I think so one thing that I think has been very helpful for us in finding those things quickly is we did start implementing we tried to do it weekly. Now we kind of have it down every other week, but we're still trying to get it down to a weekly cadence of like actually having a leadership meeting every single week. I think it's really helpful to, if you have nothing, if everybody's super busy, at the very least, do a highs and lows conversation about your highs for the week and the lows for the week. It's amazing, I think, how quickly the lows can translate into, okay, there's actually like a problem. Because usually, usually one of the areas where there's, I think, a big gap is some type of, especially when you're growing really, really quickly, in engineering parlance, we'll use it as like technical debt that accrues, but it's like,
right,
area from an infrastructure standpoint where like we can't, like it's creating a lot of like unnecessary cycles to be spent on something that should be a lot easier. And usually that ends up being something that multiple leaders are going to sort of simultaneously be saying, because usually they're like, I mean this nicely, but like butting heads on the same kinds of issues. And so it can sometimes be a really fast way of like picking up on the fact that there is a problem. For sure, for like, I think most tech companies, at some point you realize that, okay, yeah, we should dampen the spend on R&D, or at least keep it flat for a little bit. And we need to spend more on sales and commercial activity. I think we're going through that right now. I think it's a really interesting inflection point. We're not done with it yet. So maybe ask me in like, a year, like how we navigated it. But there is a big shift. I mean, like within an organization, when you start transitioning from like, 100% engineering kind of product focus into, like true like customer and like selling and things like that, those are a big shift. And so I think like understanding how many pieces actually go into that, there's a lot of opportunity there for like, okay, yeah, we hired some salespeople, but we forgot about their marketing assets that they need, or, there's nobody focusing on health plans, or there's nobody focusing on demand gen or things like that. And there's another entire side of the organization that needs to be built out. And so although the organization may be fairly mature in certain areas, it's very nascent in other areas. And I think that can cause a little bit of a shift, because you've got a really stable part of the company, and then you've got another part that's almost like in its infancy. And you've got to kind of be dealing with both in parallel. And so I think that it presents, yes, you need to deal with the problem, but it also presents some challenges in terms of the way that you approach the issue, because, you're dealing with a teenager and, a 2-year-old child at the same time. And it becomes important to make sure you're doing a good job of, of handling both.
Yeah, and something that you raised there that I think is it seems so simple, but the idea of soliciting feedback from your employees or your managers of highs and lows, not just in terms of, not asking the question necessarily, what can we work on, but what is something negative about your experience right now? Because I think that first of all, not everyone feels comfortable and feeling like they're whining or are being negative or anything like that. But something you touched on that I think is really valuable is the idea that and sharing your experiences, sometimes you don't even realize or have the introspection to realize this was something negative that happened in my day-to-day, but that's actually because of something structural within our company that we can address, that we can fix. And that's something that in my career has revealed itself over the past few years. You know, to me, it was like, oh, I just need to work harder. Well, that's not always the right answer. So I think that it sounds like you have a lot of different strategies that you're using, that it's very principles based, very organized, that I think, you know, you've clearly gotten yourself to a Series B, which many founders have a lot of difficulty getting to. And so I think that has clearly only served you well. So it's great to hear that guidance from you. I realize we're at 101 now, and I know Cathy needed to drop off. Anyone who has any questions, please feel free. I believe Amy and Lubna could both stay on the line for a few minutes just to answer any questions as they come in. Now's the time to answer any of your questions. So I see one question is the question, have any of you formed partnerships, and how did you get to the point of bringing on other shareholders? How did you find the right partnership? And so I think that question, Lubna, I'm curious, you know, as you've been operating, are you operating basically as a sole founder, or have you been operating as within a partnership? And Amy, I know you're coming from an HR perspective, but maybe you can speak to what partnerships you've witnessed.
So for me, I started Invoy by myself. There's strengths and weaknesses, I mean, good things and bad things about that. On one hand, there is one decision maker, so sometimes that's actually a good thing. On the other hand, it's also very lonely. So like it's you kind of have to like pull from those different perspectives. And there's some very successful companies with, you know, sole founders, and there's some very successful companies that actually had a co-founder approach. I think that's, you know, it just sort of depends. On the investor selection side, I've learned a lot in terms of, I think it's really important, I think, to view each investor relationship through the notion of how is this party going to behave when things are at the beginning of the relationship, and how patient are they going to be when things are like kind of like really a problem. And I think a lot of that, it's kind of hard to evaluate, but a lot of it, you kind of have to get comfortable interviewing your investors, prospective investors, which I think is very uncomfortable. And it's not like go do a legal background check. It's not that, but it's like it's the same level of sort of like, you know, like how are they going to approach these different problems? Because almost every party that has like a decent amount of money is able to answer most questions well. But I think like interviewing for like how that relationship is going to go over a period of time is really helpful. I think one thing, if I were to pick one piece of advice that I would have for, you know, at least early like founders that are new to startup space that are coming in, is try to get a good sense up front for whether a given investor is actually interested in a follow-on round. Because I think a lot of times what happens is people get like really excited about a seed stage investor, not realizing that seed stage investor is actually not in a position to help you in your next round. And so you're doing a lot of activities in service of like that investor, instead of also in parallel with that, like really going and soliciting feedback from people who are in the next phase that can kind of help you get ready for that. And then maybe related to that, though, you have to remember that regardless of whether they're participating in that next round or not, if you took them on, they're your investor for the rest of the company's journey. So you still owe them updates, you know? And so like,
Right.
even if they aren't relevant to today's money problem, you know, they are still part of like your family, and you're still obligated to like, you know, legally obligated, or just like, you know, culturally, you still need to like, you know, keep them in the loop because they did invest in kind of like what you've built. So I think in that sense, then make sure you're comfortable with the fact that when their check runs out, like you need to like them enough that you're still going to be talking to them when you're dealing with fresh money, right? I think being really mindful of that is something that I had to learn over the course of like a set of experiences, but it's something that I would probably, suggest that people, do from the beginning.
Yeah.
Because I think it really helps down the road.
That's excellent advice, and something that, it's so difficult because when founders, especially if it's their first raise, if the money is willing to come in, you just want to take the money. And something that I try and guide my clients to ask their investors is, what's the vintage of the fund? So where are they in terms of how much capital they've deployed? What's the history of this VC in terms of, is this their first fund that they've raised? And what's their philosophy? Because oftentimes they'll tell you, we're just an early stage, VC, you're going to get this money from us. Don't expect us to follow on in the future because we only make this amount of investments. And sometimes there are exceptions to the rules, but they should be able to tell you that. You should be able to speak to their other portfolio of companies in terms of, did they follow on? Did they really commit? And it's hard, right? Because sometimes you might not necessarily have the option of shopping around and finding someone. And I think it is difficult to find a VC that, if it's an early stage VC, is going to commit to a growth stage, because oftentimes those are very different funds. They operate differently. But I think the point you raise is really good, to do some amount of diligence into who you're investing. And just, if you have to take the money and that's it, great. That you're limited in your options, but to the extent that you have options, good to figure out who you're getting in bed with, because they might not be a co-founder with you, but you are very much going to be communicating with them down the line, and they have a strong effect.
If I can just maybe make one follow-up comment on that, it's also like really important to realize when you actually at some point get like legitimate money into the company, the early stage people oftentimes have the highest loyalty to you as a founder. And so it kind of behooves you to have like made sure you preserve those relationships, as rocky as the path probably is at the beginning. Like it's just really important to keep that communication cadence together. And even if you do not have the luxury, which I would completely agree with, that very few people have the ability to say like, oh, I had 5 deals on the table, and so I picked the one that I vetted the most, and they were the perfect fund. Like nobody really has that opportunity. I think talking to somebody like Paige, and at least understanding who you are dealing with, it's kind of the same thing as like, look, if you hire a software engineer and you know that they're going to be really great for year 1 and 2, but they're not necessarily, there's a growth trajectory for them to make it to year 3 or whatever. Like, if you know that getting in, you can manage it differently, right? And so I think like just making sure that you have that conversation and just not being afraid to ask, right? Like those questions, even though like, I don't know, I feel like I was told from my legal counsel at the beginning to ask questions like that. And of course I never did, but
we do our best, we put it out there, and we know that
it's an awkward conversation.
Yeah.
What am I like? How am I supposed to ask somebody else, like, if this is their first fund? Like, I'm not gonna I don't even know what a fund means, and people talk about vehicles of their like new fund. Like, I just don't understand, and so I think there's a lot of confusion around that. But I think to the extent that you can get comfortable asking those questions, it's totally worth it.
Yeah, and also Google is your friend.
Yeah.
There's a surprising amount that you can find out through some deep stalking. So I see this next question from Kevin. I have heard horror stories from startup founders outsourcing due to communication or management problems. Any comments on this from the panelists? What steps were taken to counter these issues? So I want to double check that. So Amy is still on. Amy, have you seen horror stories from HR, or, it's a free for all, so feel free to jump in with whatever thoughts you have.
No, I do think you can. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about really being clear on what the scope of work is, what the expectations are, what the deliverables are, and then really having that, the kind of checks and balances in place to monitor and manage those outsourced resources, because they can, you can start just burning through money and really not getting anything in return. So it's being able to step in quickly and address address those issues, but really you can't, it's really very rarely can you set it and forget it. You just have to stay on top of it. And we've all had them. We've all had those things happen where it's just like, oh my gosh, we have nothing to show for all that money that we spent. So, it's being able to just step in quickly.
Yeah, and Lubna, how about you? Any outsourcing nightmares?
Yeah, I mean, like I completely echo what Amy just said. I mean, I think most startups have had their horror story on outsourcing. And I really think the key is you have to know, like, maybe saying it a little bit more succinctly than what I said before. You have to assume that your company is responsible for fixing all the problems that your company has. Like,
Right.
and so you can't just outsource the problem, so like you can outsource the need for XYZ to be done, but the problem itself is yours to fix. And so if you can use an external resource to get that done, that's great. But like, the point that Amy brought up, which I thought was really great, on like, yes, we would use HR functions, to handle certain things. I mean, there are startups that use PEOs well, for instance, like just staying on the HR topic, there's startups that use PEOs horribly, and so like, you have to know, like, if your issue is going to be, like, we had somebody at one point who was helping us out on kind of like basic HR things, and would come into the office. And like, I remember there's one employee who came to her and said, I need help selecting my benefits. And this person took me forever to find. And it wasn't even like a senior position. It was like a junior position, but it was a really hard position staff. And the person said, well, you know what? Here's the phone number for the PEO. You need to call them. They're going to help you figure out the benefits, right? That person like quit, and so like, there's a certain time period where like, part of the role is like, if you are going to hire people, like you do need to have somebody that can talk to them when they're, having a hard time with a particular issue, right? Instead of it being something where you can just delegate it out. And this, by the way, was a very trivial issue. I mean, this wasn't even like this was like somebody struggling between an HMO and a PPO plan. You know what I mean? It's like a super basic issue. It could have easily been like a 5-minute conversation and you would have avoided this problem. But you do need to have somebody that's able to do that takes ownership for that. And then, yeah, if it's a more complicated issue, you can outsource it, to your PEO or whatever, if you're using somebody like that. So I just think your problems are your problems. You've got to own them. And, but use, I mean, we have a great relationship with our PEO, which we're using right now. And that's great. But we still have to have somebody within the company that's going to take ownership of managing that relationship and making sure that, our problems are our problems.
Yeah, and ownership. I mean, that's something that I thought I knew what the meaning was when I began my career, but as I get more senior and as I'm, delegating a lot, you understand like that it is such a critical component and something that when you bring up outsourcing, I cannot remember. There's a very famous VC who says this, but it's one of my favorite quotes, which is that you can't outsource critical thinking, which I think the idea is that, you can create systems basically like a computer program that go function, but there has to be an author of whatever that is. There has to be someone that's mindfully thinking, and you can't just, give something mindlessly and then expect it to unfold. And that takes time. And so I think the idea is that if you delegate effectively, that frees up your time to be managing, but you still have to manage.
So, and it brings up one of the broader topics that we've been talking about on HR planning and stuff like that. Like, if you're going to start a company, if you're going to be part of the executive team of a company, you own that company's plan and blueprint, period. And that means you should know every process and every person that needs to be brought into the organization. At some point in time, it's your responsibility to put that in place. And then, yeah, if you want, process step 2 to be outsourced or process step 2 to be hired in-house, I guess it doesn't really matter, but like the blueprint is yours. So I like what you said about critical thinking. I mean, that's absolutely right. Like the person who made the process should be in-house.
Right.
Who owns the process should be in-house, right? And then how you delegate the resources, like that's, there are 100 different ways you can do that. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so I think that we are actually perfect on time. I don't see any other questions. So I just want to thank everyone who's been on the panel today, Amy, Lubna, and I know Cathy jumped off, but your responses have been so informative, substantive. It's really great to hear from you. And cherry on top, it's great to hear from women who are involved in these industries as well.
Thank you so much.
Thanks
Well,
so
I just want to add my thanks. Thank you to Paige for amazing moderating and all of our panelists for joining today. I wish that this had been in person. The energy is always so fabulous in the room, and but we really appreciate you for hanging in there as we shifted the panel to this webinar format from our original plan to be in person. And maybe we can tap you again next year when we hope to be in person. But, you know, I just want to remind everyone that if you do have any assistance you need with your business and any advice on all these topics, please reach out to us. And all our contact information is up on the screen now for no cost, no catch one-on-one consulting for any high-tech, high-growth, scalable business in the Orange County or Inland Empire. We're here to help everyone through these challenging times and beyond. We hope everyone can join us next Thursday at noon for our Women Talk Tech panel on angel investing. We'll have a wonderful experience lineup of female founders and executives talking about why they invest and why they might want to invest in you, and how you can take their money to spend on all the topics we talked about today. Again, you'll receive the recording and slides tomorrow via email. And if you'd like more information, again, call us at 800-616-7232 or go to sbdctech.org/contact and we'll pair you with a consultant. We're here to help you and your business start, grow, and succeed. So thank you so much for joining us, and stay safe and healthy. Thank you again to our amazing panel. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.